The moor did not announce itself. It simply was, grey and vast and indifferent to the small arrangements of human life conducted at its edge, and Ravenshaw Estate sat at that edge like a house that had been placed there by accident and had never quite recovered from the surprise of its own position. November on the moor was not like November elsewhere. Elsewhere, November was a month of managed inconvenience, wet cobblestones, shortened afternoons, the minor social recalibrations required by the change in weather. On the moor, November was a different proposition entirely. The wind came from the north with the conviction of something that has decided, and the rain came not vertically but at angles that made umbrellas a theoretical rather than practical defense, and the paths between the house and the outbuildings, the kitchen garden, the small stone chapel, the ice house at the property's western edge, became, within 48 hours of the first serious rain, a negotiation between intention and mud. Cecily had been negotiating these paths for 3 years. She had learned their particular logic, which stones held, which gave way, where the drainage was reliable and where it was aspirational. She had learned this the way she had learned everything about Ravenshaw Estate, not because anyone had taught her, but because knowledge of the terrain was the difference between managing and not managing, and not managing was not, for her, a category she permitted herself. She was 23 years old, and she was the last remaining Alderton of Ravenshaw, which meant she was both its mistress and its most capable servant, these two roles having collapsed into one another over the 3 years since her father's death, had revealed the true state of the estate's finances. The staff had reduced, the maintenance had reduced, the social calendar had reduced to nothing, which was perhaps the one reduction Cecily did not mourn. What remained was the house, and the land, and the work of keeping both from becoming entirely past saving. She was crossing the kitchen garden path on the morning of the 14th, heading to the ice house with a list of what remained of the winter stores, a task that would take 30 minutes and that she had been putting off for a week because the result would not be pleasant, when the path gave way, not catastrophically, not a fall, simply the specific, deliberate sinking of a stone that had appeared solid and was not, and the resulting lurch that sent her left boot 6 inches into the mud, and the grab for balance that sent her right hand into it as well, and the small metallic sound of something coming loose from her hair and disappearing. She straightened. She looked at her hand. She looked at the mud. She looked at the place where her mother's tortoiseshell hair clasp had, until approximately 4 seconds ago, been holding the back of her hair in the arrangement she made every morning with the automatic care of someone who has very little left of a person and treats what remains accordingly. She knelt. There was no question of not kneeling. It was mud, and it was cold, and the rain was coming sideways from the north in the way that it did on the moor in November, and none of this was relevant. She pressed her fingers into the mud where she had heard the sound, working in careful arcs, systematic, the way she approached all problems that required patience rather than force. She did not hear the footsteps on the path behind her. She was entirely focused, both hands in the mud now, working outward from the point of impact, and her hair loose around her face where the clasp had been, and the rain coming down, and nothing existing in that moment except the small, specific, absolute necessity of finding what she had lost. "You've dropped something." The voice came from directly behind her and above her, which meant the person was standing and she was kneeling, and she registered this arrangement with the particular composure of a woman who has been found in undignified positions before and has learned that the dignified response is to finish what she's doing before she acknowledges the interruption. "Yes," she said, without turning. "I'm aware." A pause. "May I help?" "I have a system," she said. Another pause. This one had a different quality. Not impatience, not amusement, but the specific quality of a man who is listening to an answer and taking it seriously. "What is the system?" "Concentric arcs from the point of impact," she demonstrated, her fingers moving outward. The clasp would have displaced a consistent distance depending on the angle of the fall. "I fell left, reached right, so the displacement should be..." Her fingers found something. Small, hard, curved. There. She closed her hand around it and stood. He was taller than she had registered from the sound of his voice. He stood on the path in a coat that was practical rather than fine. Dark wool, worn at the elbows, the kind of coat a working man wore in weather like this. And he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the expression of a man who has just watched a woman kneel in the mud and found it amusing. Something more careful than that. She became aware of her hands, both of them coated in mud from the wrist down, the clasp in her right fist also muddy, her hair loose, her boots unquestionably compromised. She was, by any reasonable assessment, a significant departure from the appearance of a woman who was the mistress of this estate. She met his gaze directly, because the alternative was to look away, and she did not do that. "You must be Mr. Ashton," she said. "The cartographer." He inclined his head. "And you must be Miss Alderton." "Yes." She looked at her hands. She looked at him. "I would offer my hand, but—" Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, or not quite a smile. The edge of one, appearing and then being managed back to neutrality, with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to be careful with his expressions. "Another time," he said. "Another time," she agreed. She walked back to the house to wash her hands, and she did not look back, and she could not have said, afterward, why she was quite so certain that he watched her go. His name was not James Ashton. This was the simplest fact, and the one that sat most uneasily with him as he stood at the window of the estate's small guest room on the evening of the 5th day, looking out at the moor in the last grey light of a November afternoon. He was James Calder, or rather, he was James Calder in the same sense that a man is the name his family gave him rather than the title that has been attached to it, and the distinction, which had once seemed academic, had become over the years increasingly important to him. The Duke of Ravenmoor was a set of obligations and expectations and performances. James Calder was the person underneath them, the one who had studied cartography seriously and surveyed 3 northern counties in his 20s, and still found, in the work of measuring and mapping, the particular satisfaction of a man who prefers truth to approximation. He had come to Ravenshaw for a reason that was entirely legitimate and had nothing to do with its current mistress. The estate's eastern boundary intersected with his own northern lands in a way that 2 decades of disputed maps had failed to resolve, and he had decided that the only solution was to survey it himself, which meant arriving as a working cartographer rather than as the adjacent landowner, because arriving as the adjacent landowner would have made the whole enterprise impossible. Lady Alderton, the previous Lady Alderton, Cecily's mother, had been a formidable social machine, and her successor, whatever she was, would inevitably have performed the required hospitality rather than permitting him to simply work. He had not known what to expect of the current Miss Alderton. He had known, because his steward had informed him with the careful neutrality of a man delivering unwelcome intelligence, that the estate was in significant financial difficulty. He had known that the household had reduced to a minimal staff. He had known that the family had effectively withdrawn from county society 3 years ago. He had not known about the mud. He had not known about the concentric arcs. He had not known about the expression on her face when she stood up with the clasp in her fist, not triumphant, not relieved, simply satisfied, in the way of a person who set a problem and has resolved it and is already moving to the next one. He had not known that she would walk back to the house with her muddy hands held away from her coat and her loose hair entirely unaddressed and her back perfectly straight, as though dignity was not a function of presentation but of something she carried internally, which could not be compromised by mud or rain or the particular embarrassment of being observed while kneeling in a kitchen garden path. He had watched her go. He was thinking about this, turning it over in the way he turned over things that required examination, when he heard her, somewhere below, close a door with the specific deliberateness of a person who has finished one task and is beginning another. He had observed her over 5 days with the attention he brought to surveys, methodical, noting details, reserving conclusions until the evidence was sufficient. What he had noted was extensive. She rose before the household. He knew this because he also rose before the household, and on the first morning he had come downstairs at 6 to find the kitchen fire already lit and the evidence, a used cup, a book open on the table, of someone who had been there an hour before him. On the second morning he had caught the edge of her, crossing the yard to the kitchen garden, before the light was properly up. She did not look like a woman beginning her day. She looked like a woman halfway through one. She managed the house with the specific, unpretentious competence of someone who has taken an honest accounting of what is required, and has decided to simply do it. He had watched her speak to the housekeeper, the one remaining housekeeper, a small, fierce woman named Mrs. Pryor, with the direct equality of two people who have reached a working arrangement beyond the usual formalities of the relationship. He had watched her repair, with a needle and thread produced from her own pocket, a tear in the dining room curtain that she noticed in passing during breakfast, standing on the chair with the unself-consciousness of someone for whom there was no audience worth performing for. He had watched her read. She read in the evenings, in the small sitting room off the main hall, by the fire that was banked lower than comfort required because coal was not, apparently, in unlimited supply. She read with the concentration of someone for whom reading is not leisure but necessity, not escape, exactly, but restoration. She held the book with both hands, and she did not look up, and she was entirely, completely, unconcernedly elsewhere. He had also watched her with the clasp. He had been returning from the eastern boundary on that morning, his notes in his bag, his boots already negotiating the worsening paths, and he had come around the corner of the kitchen garden wall and stopped. She was ahead of him on the path, and he had seen the stone give, seen the lurch, heard the small metallic sound, and watched her kneel without hesitation. He had stood there, he had watched her work, the systematic arcs, both hands in the mud, the rain on her back, and he had felt something he had not expected to feel, which was the specific, inconvenient feeling of a man who has just watched someone be entirely, uncomplicatedly themselves, and has found it more beautiful than anything performed has ever been. He had spoken because he could not continue to stand in silence without the silence becoming its own kind of statement. He had offered to help because he had meant it, and when she had said, "I have a system," with the complete, undefensive certainty of a person who was not performing competence but simply had it, he had felt, quite without his permission, something in him go entirely still. He had not felt still in a long time. On the morning of the 6th day, she lost it again. Not in the mud this time. In the small pantry off the kitchen where she had been taking inventory by candlelight and had set the clasp on the shelf beside the candle to keep her hair out of her face while she wrote, and had finished the inventory and walked out and left it there without thinking. She discovered this at breakfast. She went back to the pantry immediately after, and the shelf was empty, and she stood there for a moment in the specific stillness of someone who has lost something they cannot replace and is attempting to remain calm about it. She checked the floor. She checked behind the candle stub. She checked the shelf below. She asked Mrs. Pryor, who had not seen it. She asked the undermaid, who had also not seen it. She returned to the pantry one more time in the afternoon and found nothing. She did not ask Mr. Ashton because there was no reason to ask Mr. Ashton. He worked on the eastern boundary during the days, and he returned in the evenings with mud on his boots and notes in his leather bag, and he ate dinner with the quiet, attentive manner of a man who is in the habit of observing without requiring the room to notice that he is doing so. He was not in the pantry. He had no connection to the pantry. She pinned her hair with a spare pin she found in her sewing basket and continued with the day, and if she felt the absence of the clasp with a sharpness disproportionate to the loss of a small object, she did not say so to anyone, because she was not in the habit of saying disproportionate things out loud. What she did not know was this: on the morning of the 5th day, the day before the pantry, the day after the mud, Mr. Ashton had come down to breakfast early and had found, on the kitchen windowsill, a small tortoiseshell clasp. Mrs. Pryor had placed it there after finding it on the kitchen garden path, and Mrs. Pryor had then been called away to address a matter of the linen inventory, and Mr. Ashton had come in and found the clasp on the sill and had stood there for a moment and had picked it up. He had intended to give it to her immediately. He had carried it from the kitchen to the dining room with the intention of placing it on the table beside her setting before she came down. He had been 3 steps from the dining room when he had heard her voice inside it, speaking to the undermaid, a quiet exchange about the morning's tasks, and he had stopped. He did not know why he had stopped. He told himself, in the moment, that it was simply a matter of timing. He would give it to her after breakfast, which would be less interrupting. He held it through breakfast in his coat pocket, turning it between his fingers without removing it, and after breakfast she had gone directly to the kitchen garden, and then directly to the East Wing accounts room, and then directly to a conversation with Mrs. Pryor that showed no signs of concluding, and the day had passed in a series of moments that were each individually not quite the right one. He examined this sequence of events in the evening with the analytical honesty of a man who has made a career of accurate measurement. He was not, he concluded, a man who had simply missed the moment. He was a man who had held a small object that belonged to her and had not given it back. And the question was why? And the answer, when he allowed himself to sit with it long enough, was both simple and alarming. He had wanted to keep it. Not permanently, not with any intention that did not bear examination, but for the specific, irrational reason that it was hers, and it was in his pocket, and there was something in the weight of it, small, worn smooth at the hinge. The tortoiseshell faded in a way that suggested decades of daily use, that felt like being trusted with something, which was not rational, because she had not given it to him. She had lost it on a path, and Mrs. Pryor had found it, and he had picked it up and had not, in the strictest accounting of the matter, been trusted with it at all. He took it out of his pocket. He looked at it in the evening light. He put it back. He would give it to her tomorrow. He was absolutely certain he would give it to her tomorrow. The rain did not stop. This was characteristic of the moor in November, and Cecily had sufficient experience of it to have built her rhythms around the assumption of wet rather than dry. The kitchen garden work moved to the covered section, the walks to the outbuildings timed to the gaps, the accounts work and the mending and the indoor tasks prioritized in the hours when going outside was more trouble than it was worth. Mr. Ashton adapted to this with what she was beginning to identify as his characteristic quality, the complete absence of complaint. She had housed, over the past 3 years, a succession of professional men whose work brought them temporarily to Ravenshaw, the solicitor, who came annually, the surveyor the bank had sent, the clergyman who covered the parish when the regular incumbent was ill, and each of them had responded to the moor's weather with varying degrees of English stoicism that were, in truth, various degrees of poorly managed dissatisfaction. The estate was not comfortable, the weather was not pleasant, the hospitality was honest but not lavish. Mr. Ashton said nothing about any of this. He came down to breakfast. He went to the eastern boundary when the weather permitted. When it didn't, he worked at the table in the estate's small library. She had offered him the use of it, without ceremony, because the alternative was that he worked in the guest room and she worked in the accounts room, and they both pretended the library was not the most functional room in the house for this kind of work. And he spread his maps and his notes across the table with the organized purpose of a man who is accustomed to working in whatever space is available and extracting from it what he needs. She worked at the other end of the same table. This had not been the plan. The plan, insofar as she had made one, was that she would offer the library and he would use it, and she would find somewhere else to do the accounts. But the accounts room was cold. The fire there was not lit except when strictly necessary, and the library fire was lit because Mr. Ashton was using it, and on the second morning she had brought her ledgers to the library table with the practical assessment that cold was a worse problem than company, and had sat down at the far end without explanation. He had looked up once. He had not asked for an explanation. He had returned to his maps. She had returned to her ledgers. They had worked in silence for 4 hours, and it had been, she examined this carefully, because it surprised her, the most comfortable 4 hours she had spent in this house in 3 years. There was something in the specific quality of his presence that was neither demanding nor absent. He was simply there, doing his own work, the scratch of his pen occasionally audible across the table, occasionally asking a brief, specific question about the estate's boundary markers that she could answer in 2 sentences and then return to what she was doing. He did not try to help with things she had not asked for help with. He did not comment on the accounts. He could see them. She was not hiding them, and they told a clear enough story to anyone with eyes, and he said nothing about them, which was both the professionally correct response and, she found, the personally welcome one. On the 4th day of rain, he looked up from his maps and said, without preamble, "The eastern boundary at the 3rd marker. The stone wall runs north-northeast, but the original survey has it north-northwest. Do you know when the wall was rebuilt?" "My grandfather's time," she said. "After the flood of 1809. The original line ran through what became the lower pasture drainage channel." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you have the estate records from that period?" 3rd shelf, left of the window. Brown spine, no title. He found it, returned to the table, opened it, and was quiet for a long time. "You know this estate very well," he said. "It's all I have," she said. Simply, without self-pity, because it was the true thing and she was not in the habit of softening the true things when no softening was required. He looked at her across the table. There was something in his expression she didn't quite have a word for. Not pity, which she would have identified and resisted immediately. Something more careful. Something that looked like a man taking in a sentence and understanding more of it than the words contained. He returned to the record. She returned to the ledgers. The rain came against the library window with its sideways, more specific insistence, and the fire burned with the careful economy she had calibrated for the space, and the scratch of 2 pens made a small, unremarkable sound in the afternoon. It was, she thought, enough. She had not thought that about any afternoon in a long time. The clasp had been gone for 8 days when she stopped looking for it. This was not a decision exactly, more the particular, pragmatic acceptance that she applied to all losses that could not be recovered. The clasp was gone. She had a spare pin. The spare pin held her hair adequately, if not with the same security. She would manage. She was very good at managing. What she did not do, and she was aware, in the way she was aware of most things, that she was not doing it, was ask Mr. Ashton. This was not because she suspected him. It was because asking him would require a conversation about why the clasp mattered, which would require explaining her mother, which was not a conversation she had with professional men who were temporarily resident in the East Wing and would be gone in another 2 weeks. She did not have that conversation with anyone. Mr. Ashton, for his part, showed no signs of knowing anything about the clasp, which was both reassuring and, in some small irrational way she refused to examine, slightly disappointing. He came to the library. He asked his specific, useful questions. He answered hers with the same precision. He ate dinner with the attentive quietness she had come to expect and occasionally said something that was, beneath its practical surface, more interesting than it first appeared. "The 3rd marker stone," he said one evening, over dinner. "The one at the boundary. Someone has tended it recently. The moss has been cleared." She looked up. "I do it in autumn. Moss obscures the survey marks." He was quiet for a moment. "You tend the boundary markers yourself. There's no one else to do it. There are some that are quite far from the house. I know where they all are." He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over the past 2 weeks. The careful, specific attention, the absence of performance. And then he said, "Of course you do," and returned to his dinner, and she felt, without quite understanding why, that it was one of the more adequate things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She found herself, in the evenings, paying attention to him in return. She had not intended to. It was simply that he was there, and she was in the habit of observing what was there, and he was. She arrived at this word carefully and found it was the right one. Interesting. Not in the social sense, the sense of a man with good conversation who performs his intelligence for the room. In a quieter sense. In the sense of a person whose surface and interior appeared to be consistent with each other, which was rarer than it should have been, and which she valued more than she had fully acknowledged. She noticed that he was precise without being rigid. He could revise when new information arrived, which distinguished him from men who were precise, because they were defensive. She noticed that he listened differently than most people listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what was said and doing something with it. She noticed that he was kind to Mrs. Pryor in the specific, unshowy way of someone who has simply been raised to treat people decently and has never reconsidered it. She noticed, once, that he watched her from the library window when she was crossing the kitchen garden path. She noticed it from the corner of her eye and did not turn, because turning would have been an acknowledgement, and she was not yet sure what she was acknowledging. She also noticed that he had a slight habit. She had catalogued it on the third day and confirmed it on the fifth and sixth, of reaching into his right coat pocket and then stopping, not withdrawing anything, simply reaching and stopping, as though checking that something was still there. She filed this observation in the same place she filed all observations that did not yet have a category, carefully and alone for later use. He had carried the clasp for 14 days. He was aware this had moved beyond any reasonable description of not quite the right moment. He was a man who was accustomed to a fairly unsparing relationship with his own motivations, and the motivation here, examined in the cold light of the 14th evening, was not complicated. He had held something of hers. He had carried something of hers. And in carrying it he had, for 14 days, a reason to reach into his pocket and be reminded that she existed, which was a reason he did not need, because she existed very thoroughly in his awareness, without any assistance from his coat pocket, but which he had apparently found necessary anyway. He was, he concluded, considerably further gone than he had permitted himself to believe. He also had, in a more practical register, been deceiving her for 14 days about the whereabouts of something she valued and could not replace, and this sat with him with increasing discomfort in the evenings when he reviewed the day. It had begun as a failure of timing. It had become, through a series of small procrastinations, something worse, not malicious, but not honest, and the distinction was one he was not comfortable allowing to blur further. He needed to tell her. He needed to give it back. He also needed to, and this was the part that was causing him the most difficulty, explain why he hadn't, which would require saying something true about why he had been reaching into his pocket every morning for 2 weeks to confirm that a small tortoiseshell hair clasp was still there, and the true explanation was not one he had practiced delivering. He was a duke. He had considerable practice with negotiations, with estate management, with the measured delivery of information in contexts where information had weight. He had less practice with, "I kept this because holding it was the nearest I could get to simply telling you that I think about you constantly," which I was not ready to say, and I am still not certain I am ready to say, but I have reached the point where the alternative is worse. He stood at his bedroom window on the 14th evening and looked at the moor in the dark and thought about this with the thoroughness it deserved. He was still thinking about it at 11 when he heard the library door open below, and then, 20 minutes later, the particular sound of a coal scuttle being attended to in the library. She banked the fires at night herself, which he knew because he had come down once at midnight and found the evidence of it. And then her steps on the stairs, steady and unhurried, and then her door. He was still thinking about it at midnight. By midnight he had arrived at the part of his thinking that he generally tried to avoid, which was the part about what came after. He was the Duke of Ravenmoor. She was the mistress of a financially distressed estate on the moor. He was residing in her house under a false name, having surveyed her boundary with the specific conflicted interest of an adjacent landowner who had not disclosed that he was an adjacent landowner. These were facts. They were not comfortable facts, and they had been growing less comfortable for every day he had sat across from her at the library table and watched her understand things, and correct things, and say the true thing without ceremony, and carry 14 unwitnessed competencies through the same day that most women of her position would have managed too. He did not permit himself to think about what came after. He permitted himself to think about tomorrow. He would find the right moment. He would return the clasp. He would tell her what he had done, and he would not dress it in better clothing than it deserved. And then, he would see. The storm came properly on the 15th day. Not the moor's characteristic sideways rain, but a genuine event. Wind that rattled the library's old window frames. Rain that came in several directions simultaneously. the kind of night that made the house feel both smaller and more necessary. Cecily lit the library fire to its full capacity for the first time since autumn, and they worked on either side of it in the particular warmth of a room that has finally been given what it needed, and the storm was so loud that ordinary conversation would have required more effort than either of them made. She became aware, at approximately 9 in the evening, that he was not working. She became aware of this because the scratch of his pen had stopped, and after a professional acquaintance of 15 days, she had developed a fairly accurate sense of what his presence sounded like in a room, and absence of pen meant absence of work. And she looked up. He was looking at her. Not the peripheral observation she had grown accustomed to, the careful, sideways attention he thought she didn't notice. This was direct. He had his pen in his hand and his notes open before him, and he was looking at her across the fire with an expression she had not seen before. The careful architecture of his face was not gone, but something in it had shifted, the way a locked room shifts when someone has finally found the key. She held the look. "Mr. Ashton," she said. "I have something of yours," he said. He reached into his right coat pocket and withdrew the clasp. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I found it on the kitchen windowsill 8 days ago," he said. "Mrs. Pryor had left it there. I intended to give it to you immediately and did not." He paused. "I have been trying to find the appropriate moment since then and have concluded, tonight, that I have been using the appropriate moment as an excuse." The storm moved against the windows. She reached out and picked up the clasp. She turned it in her fingers, the familiar weight of it, the worn hinge, the faded tortoiseshell. She held it for a moment. "An excuse for what?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. "For not having to give it back," he said. She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze with the expression of a man who has decided to stop managing what is on his face. "Why did you want to keep it?" she said. This was the question he had been unable to answer adequately for 15 days. He found, now, that the answer was simpler than he had made it. "Because it was yours," he said, "and I had very little else of yours that I was permitted to hold." The room was very quiet. The storm was very loud. These two things existed simultaneously and did not interfere with each other. Cecily set the clasp on the table before her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You are not a cartographer," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "No, not professionally. You know cartography. Comprehensively. It was a serious study. The survey work is genuine." He kept his voice even. "My name is not Ashton." "I know," she said. He went still. "You know." "I have known for approximately 9 days." She kept her eyes on the clasp. "You stand differently than a man who has always been a working professional. You use silences in a way that suggests someone accustomed to rooms where your silence has weight." She looked up. "And your coat is the wrong kind of worn. It is worn deliberately. The wear is distributed incorrectly for a man who has actually worked in it." He stared at her. "I looked at the boundary maps," she said. "The notation style on your survey matches the Duke of Ravenmoor's estate records. I retrieved the relevant correspondence from my father's files on the 7th day." She paused. "I was waiting to see if you would tell me yourself." He sat with this. He sat with it for a long time. "And when I didn't," he said slowly, "I decided to continue waiting." She met his gaze. "I wanted to know whether you would." He understood. He understood with the full weight of what she had given him, the patience of it, the specific generosity of a woman who had known and had said nothing and had waited, not from passivity, but from the decision to give him the space to do the right thing himself. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the name, for the length of time." "I know why you did it," she said. "The boundary question is genuinely yours to resolve, and arriving as yourself would have made the work impossible." She paused. "I understand the methodology. Do you?" It came out quieter than he intended. "I have spent 3 years managing this estate in ways I could not do if everyone saw me clearly," she said. "I understand the value of being underestimated." He looked at her across the fire and the storm and the small worn clasp on the table between them, and he thought, for the 100th time, or the 200th, that she was the most honest person he had been in a room with in longer than he could measure, and that honesty had a cost, and she had been paying it alone, and that he would very much like, if she would permit it, to sit with her on the paying side of it. "My name is James," he said. "James Calder." She was quiet for a moment. "Cecily," she said. "Not Miss Alderton, simply the name, simply the plain, direct thing." He picked up the clasp from the table. He turned it in his fingers once, the familiar gesture, the pocket gesture, but open now, on the table between them. He held it out to her. "I should have given this back on the first morning," he said. She took it from his hand. Their fingers met for just a moment in the transfer, not by accident, not by design, simply the natural contact of a small object passing between two people who are sitting close enough to pass small objects. She held the clasp. She held his gaze. "You can be forgiven," she said, "for needing a little time." He felt something shift in him, something that had been held against itself for 15 days, for longer than 15 days, for considerably longer than this house and this moor and this storm, releasing. "Cecily," he said. "James," she said, and the name in her mouth was the simplest and the most significant thing he had heard in years. She put the clasp back in her hair that night. She did it in the library, without leaving the room, while he watched without comment, her hands reaching back with the practiced ease of 23 years of the same motion, the clasp finding the familiar position, her hair secured. She did it simply, without self-consciousness, as she did everything, and when it was done she looked at him, and his expression was the one she had first seen on the kitchen garden path. Not quite a smile, the edge of it, controlled and then not controlled, something arriving against his will that he had decided, tonight, not to manage back to neutrality. She let herself look at it. She had been careful with her own looking, careful for 15 days, in the way she was careful with all things she could not afford to lose carelessly. She had looked sideways and looked away and looked at him in moments when he was not looking at her, building her understanding of him in the safe hours when it did not require acknowledgement. She was done being careful. "Tell me something true," she said. He looked at her. "About what?" "Anything." She held his gaze. "You have been very precise for 15 days. Tell me something that isn't precise." He was quiet for a moment. The storm was still against the windows. The fire had burned to a low, steady amber. "I came here for the boundary survey," he said. "That is true, but I have not thought about the boundary survey in approximately 11 days. He paused. "I have thought about almost nothing except this room, and the person in it." She was quiet. "That is imprecise," he said. "No," she said. "That is exactly precise." He looked at her across the low fire with the full, unmanaged expression, the one she had seen the edge of for 15 days and now saw complete. And it was the expression of a man who has been alone in a specific way for a long time and has just found that the aloneness was not, as he had concluded, permanent. "I would like to come back," he said. "Not as Ashton, not for the boundary." He looked at her steadily. "For you, if you would permit it." She considered this. She considered it with the honest attention she gave to all decisions that mattered, and what she found, when she looked at it directly, without the careful management of the preceding weeks, was that she had already decided. She had decided, she thought, on the kitchen garden path, watching him stand in the rain and offer to help and take seriously the answer that she had a system. She had decided when he sat across from her at the library table and asked useful questions and made no comment on the accounts. She had decided when he looked at her with the expression that cost him something to show. She had been waiting for him to catch up. "I would permit it," she said. He stood. He came around the table, not quickly, not with any urgency that would have required her to receive it before she was ready, and he stopped before her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of a man who has arrived where he intended to be and finds it exactly right. He held out his hand. She looked at it. She thought of the kitchen garden path, her muddy hand, his held out. "Another time," she had said. He had remembered. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around it with the steadiness of someone who has decided, not possession, not urgency, simply the warm, specific, deliberate closing of a man who has found what he was carrying someone else's clasp to avoid saying. Outside, the storm did what storms do on the moor. It continued, indifferent to small human arrangements, vast and dark, and entirely unconcerned. Inside the library, the fire burned low and amber, and two people sat by it with their hands joined, and the boundary question, which had brought one of them here, sat unresolved on the map table, and neither of them, for the moment, minded at all. He came back in March. He came as himself. The Duke of Ravenmoor, announced properly, arrived with a reasonable retinue, received by Mrs. Pryor with the specific expression of a woman who has known something for months and is gratified to see it arrive in official form. He came in better weather, which was to say weather that was only somewhat sideways, rather than comprehensively so, and the moor in March had the particular quality of a landscape that has been holding something in reserve and is beginning to release it, the first brown-green of the heather, the light lasting until 5. Cecily met him at the door. She was wearing the clasp. He noticed this immediately, and she saw him notice it, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing to say about it that the noticing hadn't already said. "Your Grace," she said, with the faint, dry precision of a woman who has decided to use the title exactly once. "Miss Alderton," he said, with the equally dry precision of a man who intends this to be the last time. Mrs. Pryor made a sound behind Cecily that she would have described, if pressed, as professional in nature. He came in. The library fire was lit. His old chair was at the table. The estate records, the third shelf, left of the window, brown spine, were in their place. He stood in the room and felt the specific quality of it, a room that had been somewhere he worked, and had become somewhere he thought of as a room he was always either in or returning to, and was now both. She stood beside him. "The boundary question," she said. "Yes. I reviewed it again in January." She crossed to the table and opened the relevant map with the easy authority of someone who has had 3 more months to know this territory. "The wall placement is defensible under the 1809 documentation. The original survey was in error, but the error has been continuous and observed for 2 decades, and continuous observed error in boundary matters typically." "Cecily," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her across the table with the expression she had first seen complete on the storm night, the unmanaged one, the one that cost him something and which he had stopped trying to manage. "I did not come for the boundary question," he said. She set down the map. "I know," she said. He came around the table. He stopped before her. He put his hand out. The same gesture, the library gesture, the kitchen garden callback, and she looked at it for one moment, the contained amusement of a woman who has catalogued a man's habits and finds them, on balance, endearing. She put her hand in his. "I have a question," he said, "that I have been constructing for approximately 4 months. Is it precise?" "Extremely." "Then ask it." He asked it, simply, directly, without the layering or the management, the plain true thing, what he wanted, what he was asking for, what he was prepared to offer in return, which was considerable and which he stated with the unembellished honesty of a man who has learned, in this specific library, at this specific table, from this specific woman, that the plain true thing is the only thing worth saying. She listened. She was quiet for a moment after. "Yes," she said, simply. The one word, unqualified, without performance, which was the only kind of answer he would have trusted and the only kind she would have given. Outside, the moor was doing its March thing, the light coming sideways now in a different way, a good way, the low gold of an afternoon that has decided to be generous. The kitchen garden paths were drying. The boundary markers were where they had always been, moss-cleared and legible. Ravenshore Estate sat at the edge of the moor, as it always had, slightly accidental, somewhat battered, entirely itself. Inside, 2 people stood by the library table with their hands joined, and the boundary question was still on the map, and it would be resolved, eventually, because both of them were thorough people, and thorough people resolved things, but not today. Today was for something that had been decided, without either of them quite noticing. On a kitchen garden path in the rain, a woman reaching into the mud for what she had lost, and a man standing behind her, who had already, without knowing the word for it yet, begun to keep what he found.